And so the man who was sent to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and deliverance to the oppressed, was sentenced to death. How is it that the servant among us met his earthly fate hanging on a cross on a barren Judean hillside?
There are only two firm historical facts about Jesus. First, he was a Jew from Nazareth who led a popular Jewish movement in Palestine at the beginning of the 1st century. And second, Rome crucified him for doing so.
So Jesus of Nazareth was a revolutionary who confronted the Judean religious establishment. He was not a peaceful spiritual leader, marriage counselor, or diplomat.
Jesus was a radical social activist who died fighting for justice and the common good. The Passion of Jesus Christ, according to Luke.
And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives.
And the disciples followed him.
And when he came to the place, he said to them,
Pray that you may not enter into temptation.
And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed.
Father,
If you are willing,
remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.
and there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him.
And being in an agony, he prayed more earnestly.
And his sweat became like great
Great
drops
drops
of
of
blood
blood.
falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them,
Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation.
While he was still speaking, there came a crowd.
And a man named Judas
One of the 12
was leading them.
He drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him,
Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?
and then when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said,
Lord, shall we strike with the sword?
and one of them,
Struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said,
No more of this.
and he touched his ear.
and healed him.
Then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him,
Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour, and the power of darkness.
And they laid hands on him.
laid hands on him, and seized him.
Here is the question that woke me up last night. It follows me through the day, that cries through every headline. Why is the face of Christ for so many a face of judgment, anger, dismissal, rather than a face of love? How did we come to give our allegiance to economic power, political parties, religious traditions, rather than to the one who calls us to come die with him, arms outstretched in loving embrace of a hurting, watching world? What would happen to our economy, our politics, our churches, if we were lovely in limb and lovely in eyes, if we lived justice daily, if all our goings reflected grace? What would it mean if we wanted for even our enemies the same welcome, forgiveness, generosity, help, joy, shalom that we crave for ourselves? What if we actively took steps to make that happen? What if Christ played through us in 10,000 places?
And they brought him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together,
Peter sat down among them.
then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said,
This man also was with him.
But he denied it.
Woman, I do not know him.
And a little later, someone else saw him and said,
You also are one of them.
Again,
He denied it.
Man, I am not.
and after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying,
Certainly this man was also with him.
for he too is a Galilean.
But Peter said,
Man, I do not know what you are talking about.
And immediately
While he was still speaking,
the rooster crowed.
And the Lord turned and looked at Peter.
And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him,
Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times.
and he went out and wept bitterly.
the social world order seems to erupt in chaos and violence on a regular basis. Regimes hold on to political power at all costs, while those who are, more often than not, economically oppressed, as opposed to just ideologically of a different mindset, demonstrate and confront government forces with little more than their willingness to stand in opposition, and in hopes that outside forces might be willing to join their struggle and match entrenched power with equal force by those who have their own national interests at stake. Despite all the blood and treasure expended in Iraq and Afghanistan in the last decade, chaos and violence continue unabated. And in the absence of direct intervention, Syria's civil war continues to turn a nation and a people that have been around since biblical times into a wasteland of destruction and refugees in flight on a massive scale. If all this seems like pure political commentary, consider this. The socio-political landscape in the first century Palestine wasn't much different. The practical means by which the imbalance of power wielded by some over others may have been rather primitive by today's technological standards, but the end game was the same. And in the context of the itinerant Jewish peasant, teacher, and sage who would long be remembered for uttering such impractical nonsense as turn the other cheek and love your enemy. This was the same historical figure that was executed as an insurrectionist, not as a resurrectionist. Jesus didn't die for our sins. He died because of them.
Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him.
They also blindfolded him and kept asking him,
Prophesy.
prophesy,
Who is it that struck you?
prophesy, prophesy to us,
O
you Christ.
When the day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together,
Both chief priests and scribes.
and they led him away to their council. And they said,
If you are the Christ,
Tell us.
But he said to them,
If I tell you,
you
will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God.
Are you then the
Son of
God?
And Jesus said to them,
You say,
I am.
what further testimony do we need? You have heard the blasphemy from his own lips.
Blasphemy.
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 People, what is your decision?
He deserves death.
Jesus was not a proponent of trying to legislate morality, of trying to get people to do what is right through higher taxation and passing laws. Jesus did not put much faith in human government to fix what was wrong with the world. Fixing the world, helping the poor, and defending the oppressed was his job, and the job he passed on to those who follow him. And fixing what is wrong with the world means looking not just at people's spiritual needs, but also their mental, emotional, psychological, and physical needs as well. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a full-orbed gospel, which addresses all of humanity's needs, and which he wants the church to spread throughout the world, and on their own initiative, not through taxation or legislation from the government. A church which calls on the government to take care of the needy in our community has surrendered, not to Jesus, but to the state. Helping the needy in our community is the job of the church, not the state.
Then
The whole company of them
arose and brought him before Pilate.
And they began to accuse him
We found this man misleading our nation.
and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar.
and saying that he himself is Christ, a king.
And Pilate asked him,
Are you the king of the Jews?
You have said so.
Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds,
I find no guilt in this man.
but they were urgent, saying,
He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place.
When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean.
And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction,
he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time.
When Herod saw Jesus,
he
was
was
very
very glad, for he had long desired to see him,
because he had heard about him.
and he was hoping to see some sign done by him.
So Herod questioned him at some length.
But Jesus made no answer.
The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him.
And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him.
Then arraying him in splendid clothing.
Herod sent him back to Pilate.
And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before this, they had been at enmity with each other.
Pilate then called together
The
the
chief
chief priests and
The elders,
The rulers of the people.
and said to them,
You brought me this man as one who is misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold,
I did not find this man guilty.
of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look,
Nothing deserving death
has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him.
But they all cried out together.
Away with this man.
Release to us Barabbas.
Barabbas was a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city.
And for murder.
Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting,
Crucify!
Crucify!
Crucify him!
Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him.
But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified.
And their voices prevailed.
Crucify him! Crucify him!
Crucify him!
Crucify him! People, what will you do with Jesus, who is called Christ?
Crucify him!
So Pilate decided.
That their demand should be granted.
He released the man who was thrown into prison for insurrection and murder.
For whom they asked.
But he delivered Jesus.
Over to their will. Good Samaritan. This parable inspired Martin Luther King's last speech to a crowd of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, popularly known as I've Been to the Mountaintop. The crescendo of this piece being the moral dilemma he presents to his audience and the ethical question he leaves them to muse over. In the days of Jesus, it came to be known as the Bloody Paths. And you know, it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over at that man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or it's possible that they felt that the man on the ground was merely faking, and he was acting like he had been robbed and hurt in order to seize them over there, to lure them there for quick and easy seizure. And so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked, was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by, and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? I can hear the reverberations of God's thoughts through the pages of this gospel. I hear God pondering, if I do not stop to help humanity, what will happen? And as they led him away,
they seized one Simon of Cyrene,
who was coming in from the country,
and they laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus.
and there followed him a great multitude of the people,
And the
who
women.
were mourning and lamenting for him.
But turning to them, Jesus said,
daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me,
But
weep for yourselves and your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say,
Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.
then they will begin to say to the mountains
Fall on us.
and to the hills,
Cover us.
for if they do these things
When the wood is green,
what will happen when it is dry?
Two others
Who were criminals.
were led away to be put to death with him.
And when they had come to the place that is called the Skull, there
they crucified him.
and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left.
The school shooting in Florida was the 18th such event in an American school this year. Soon there will be so many they won't be news. They'll be read out like the football results each Saturday afternoon. The announcer will say, here are this week's shooting sprees in schools: Kansas 3, Wyoming 1, Montana 2, Texas 4. And then instead of moaning about these incidents, they can be incorporated into lessons. A math teacher might say, this morning there were 28 of us in the classroom. Now 4 of us have been shot. Expresses a fraction the amount of us who have survived. Americans' insistence about the right to own guns is sometimes difficult for outsiders to comprehend, but it's linked to our fundamentalist Christian beliefs. Because when Jesus was asked what he would do if someone slapped him on the right cheek, he said, load my A-15 semi-automatic rifle and shoot up a shopping center in Nazareth.
And Jesus said,
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing.
And they cast lots to divide his garments.
and the people stood by watching.
But the rulers scoffed at him.
He saved others.
Let him save himself.
If he is the Christ of God,
The Christ of God.
his
His
chosen
chosen one.
one.
The soldiers also mocked him.
Coming up and offering him sour wine and saying,
If you are the king of the Jews,
Save yourself.
There was also an inscription over him.
this is the king of the Jews.
People, hail your king.
Hail, King of the Jews!
One of the criminals who were hanged
Railed at him,
saying, "Are you not the Christ?
Save yourself and us.
But the other rebuked him. Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds. But this man
Has done nothing wrong.
Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom."
Truly, I say to you,
Today,
you will be with me in paradise.
It was now about the 6th hour, and
There was darkness
darkness
over the whole land until the 9th hour.
While the sun's light failed,
and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom,
And the rocks were split.
and the curtain was torn.
and the earth shook,
And the curtain was torn.
And the rocks were split.
and the earth shook,
And the curtain was torn.
And the tombs were opened.
And the rocks were
And
split.
the curtain was
And the
torn.
earth shook.
And the rocks were split.
and the earth shook,
And the rocks were
And
split.
the earth shook open.
And the rocks
And the
were
earth
split.
shook were
And the
opened.
curtain was torn in two from top to bottom.
Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said,
Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.
and having said this,
He breathed his last.
part of the American church's history includes genocide and colonization of indigenous people all over the world, and slavery of African people, all marked by the actions, words of people claiming Christ as conqueror. Today we're still wrestling with the consequences of those actions. We're wrestling with an American Christianity that was built on the backs of those actions. It may be our history of racism, our patriarchal power plays, or our blind eye toward the least of these, the poor, widowed, orphan. Maybe it's lack of care for the earth and the creatures on it, or the constant support of companies that take advantage of the earth's resources and the poor communities that have what the rich want. How are we to reconcile this? Now, when the centurion saw what had taken place,
he praised God, saying,
Certainly, this man was innocent.
And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle
when they saw what had taken place,
returned home, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances
and the women who had followed him from Galilee,
stood at a distance, watching these things.
Now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea,
he was a member of the council
a good and righteous man,
who had not consented to their decision and action.
and he was looking for the kingdom of God.
This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus.
Then he took it down,
Took it down and wrapped it in a linen shroud,
And laid him in a tomb cut in stone.
You can't be a Christian by yourself. If I kept participating in communion, I'd have to swallow the fact of my connection with all other people without exception. I didn't deserve communion myself now. I wasn't getting it because I was good. I wasn't getting it because I was special. I certainly didn't get to pick who else was good enough, holy enough, deserving enough to receive it. It wasn't a private meal. The bread on that table had to be shared with everyone in order for me to really taste it. The faith I was finding was jagged and more difficult. It wasn't about abstract theological debates. It was about action.
When I look around and see rising poverty and inequality, sexism, racism, religious persecution, and environmental destruction, I pray for the courage that I lack to be a radical social activist like Jesus.